The Magic Ring, a fairy tale from the Yellow Fairy Book, Part 1. Once upon a time there lived an old couple who had one son called Martin. Now when the old man's time had come, he stretched himself out on his bed and died. Though all his life long he had toiled and moiled, he only left his widow and son 200 florins. The old woman determined to put by the money for a rainy day, but alas, the rainy day was close at hand, for their meal was all consumed, and who was prepared to face starvation with 200 florins at their disposal? So the old woman counted out 100 of her florins, and giving them to Martin, told him to go into the town and lay in a store of meal for a year. So Martin started off for the town. When he reached the meat market, he found the whole place in turmoil, and a great noise of angry voices and barking of dogs. Mixing in the crowd, he noticed a staghound which the butchers had caught and tied to a post, and which was being flogged in a merciless manner. Overcome with pity, Martin spoke to the butchers, saying, "Friends, why are you beating the poor dog so cruelly?" "We have every right to beat him," they replied. "He has just devoured a newly killed pig." "Leave off beating him," said Martin, "and sell him to me instead." "If you choose to buy him," answered the butchers derisively, "but for such a treasure we won't take a penny less than 100 florins." "100!" exclaimed Martin. "Well, so be it, if you will not take less." And taking the money out of his pocket, he handed it over in exchange for the dog, whose name was Schurka. When Martin got home, his mother met him with the question, "Well, what have you bought?" "Schurka the dog," replied Martin, pointing to his new possession, whereupon his mother became very angry and abused him roundly. He ought to be ashamed of himself, when there was scarcely a handful of meal in the house, to have spent the money on a useless brute like that. On the following day she sent him back to the town, saying, "Here, take our last 100 florins and buy provisions with them. I have just emptied the last grains of meal out of the chest and baked a bannock, but it won't last over tomorrow." Just as Martin was entering the town, he met a rough-looking peasant who was dragging a cat after him by a string which was fastened around the poor beast's neck. "Stop!" cried Martin. "Where are you dragging that poor cat?" "I mean to drown him," was the answer. "What harm has the poor beast done?" said Martin. "It has just killed a goose," replied the peasant. "Don't drown him. Sell him to me instead," begged Martin. "Not for 100 florins," was the answer. "Surely for 100 florins you'll sell it," said Martin. "See, here is the money." And so saying, he handed him the 100 florins, which the peasant pocketed, and Martin took possession of the cat, which was called Waska. When he reached his home, his mother greeted him with the question, "Well, what have you brought back?" "I have brought this cat, Waska," answered Martin. "And what besides?" "I had no money over to buy anything else with," replied Martin. "You useless ne'er-do-weel!" exclaimed his mother in a great passion. "Leave the house at once, and go and beg your bread among strangers." And as Martin did not dare to contradict her, he called Schurka and Waska and started off with them to the nearest village in search of work. On the way he met a rich peasant who asked him where he was going. "I want to get work as a day laborer," he answered. "Come along with me, then. But I must tell you, I engage my laborers without wages. If you serve me faithfully for a year, I promise you it shall be for your advantage." So Martin consented, and for a year he worked diligently and served his master faithfully, not sparing himself in any way. When the day of reckoning had come, the peasant led him into a barn, and pointing to 2 full sacks, said, "Take whichever of these you choose." Martin examined the contents of the sacks, and seeing that one was full of silver and the other of sand, he said to himself, There must be some trick about this. I had better take the sand." And throwing the sack over his shoulders, he started out into the world in search of fresh work. On and on he walked, and at last he reached a great, gloomy wood. In the middle of the wood he came upon a meadow where a fire was burning, and in the midst of the fire, surrounded by flames, was a lovely damsel, more beautiful than anything Martin had ever seen. And when she saw him, she called to him, "Martin, if you would win happiness, save my life. Extinguish the flames with the sand that you earned in payment of your faithful service." Truly, thought Martin to himself, it would be more sensible to save a fellow being's life with this sand than to drag it about on one's back, seeing what a weight it is. And forthwith he lowered the sack from his shoulders and emptied its contents on the flames, and instantly the fire was extinguished. But at the same moment, lo and behold, the lovely damsel turned into a serpent, and darting upon him, coiled itself around his neck, and whispered lovingly in his ear, "Do not be afraid of me, Martin. I love you, and will go with you through the world. But first you must follow me boldly into my father's kingdom underneath the earth, and when we get there, remember this. He will offer you gold and silver and dazzling gems, but do not touch them. Ask him instead for the ring which he wears on his little finger, for in that ring lies a magic power. You have only to throw it from one hand to the other, and at once 12 young men will appear, who will do your bidding, no matter how difficult, in a single night." So they started on their way, and after much wandering they reached a spot where a great rock rose straight up in the middle of the road. Instantly the serpent uncoiled itself from his neck, and as it touched the damp earth, it resumed the shape of the lovely damsel. Pointing to the rock, she showed him an opening just big enough for a man to wriggle through. Passing into it, they entered a long underground passage, which led out onto a wide field, above which spread a blue sky. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent castle, built out of porphyry, with a roof of gold and with glittering battlements. And his beautiful guide told him that this was the palace in which her father lived and reigned over his kingdom in the underworld. Together they entered the palace and were received by the king with great kindness. Turning to his daughter, he said, "My child, I had almost given up the hope of ever seeing you again. Where have you been all these years?" "My father," she replied, "I owe my life to this youth, who saved me from a terrible death." Upon which the king turned to Martin with a gracious smile, saying, "I will reward your courage by granting you whatever your heart desires. Take as much gold, silver, and precious stones as you choose." "I thank you, mighty king, for your gracious offer," answered Martin, "but I do not covet either gold, silver, or precious stones. Yet if you will grant me a favor, give me, I beg, the ring from off the little finger of your royal hand. Every time my eye falls on it, I shall think of your gracious majesty, and when I marry, I shall present it to my bride." So the king took the ring from his finger and gave it to Martin, saying, "Take it, good youth, but with it I make one condition. You are never to confide to anyone that this is a magic ring. If you do, you will straightway bring misfortune on yourself." Martin took the ring, and having thanked the king, he set out on the same road by which he had come down into the underworld. When he had regained the upper air, he started for his old home, and having found his mother still living in the old house where he had left her, they settled down together very happily. So uneventful was their life that it almost seemed as if it would go on in this way always, without let or hindrance. End of part 1.